In 1956, China's Air Force was flying propeller-age leftovers dressed up as jets, copies of Soviet designs built under license, decades behind the West, in almost every measurable way. 70 years later, in the summer of 2026, Chinese state television released official footage of a tailless aircraft with 3 engines and no vertical tail at all, a design so radical that American Air Force planners quietly admitted it might reach operational status before their own next-generation fighter does. That is the distance this story covers. 22 aircraft, from Korean War-era copies to prototypes still being flight-tested today, trace how one Air Force went from pure imitation to genuine innovation in under a lifetime. Some of these jets were dead ends, abandoned on paper or shelved after a handful of test flights. A few of them are now rewriting what Western planners thought they understood about the next 50 years of air combat. Along the way, there are canceled programs that never got off the ground, export successes that reshaped entire foreign air forces, and at least one aircraft flying today with no pilot inside it at all. This is that story, told machine by machine, generation by generation. Chapter 1: Cold War Copies, where China's jet age began. The Shenyang J-5 entered service in 1956 as China's very first jet fighter, and it was, in every meaningful sense, someone else's aircraft. It was a direct copy of the Soviet MiG-17F, built under license at a time when China had almost no aerospace industry of its own to speak of. Top speed sat around Mach 0.93, still subsonic, armed with a single 37mm cannon and 2 smaller 23mm guns, and absolutely nothing else, no radar. No guided weapons of any kind. Combat, if it came, meant looking your enemy in the eye at close range, the same way pilots had fought 15 years earlier over Europe. By the time the type was finally retired, it wasn't fighting wars anymore. It was training the next generation of Chinese pilots who would eventually design and build the country's own aircraft from scratch. It's an easy aircraft to dismiss today, but every single fighter on this list, even the tailless prototypes still being tested right now, exists because a country with almost no aviation industry decided in 1956 that it needed to learn how to build jets before it could ever hope to design them. 2 years later came something considerably faster. The J-6 was China's first supersonic fighter, a reverse-engineered copy of the Soviet MiG-19, and it broke Mach 1.35 at a time when almost no other air force in Asia could say the same. More than 3,000 were eventually built, making it one of the most produced fighter designs in Chinese aviation history. It carried 3 30mm cannons and later primitive infrared guided missiles, and remarkably, it stayed in frontline PLAAF service well into the 1980s, only formally retired from Chinese service around 2010. Half a century of operational life, from an airframe designed in the 1950s. Some late-modeled J-6 airframes were even converted into unmanned target drones after retirement, still flying, just without anyone left inside them. This one was different. In 1965, Nanchang took that same J-6 lineage and reshaped it entirely for a completely new mission: ground attack. The Q-5 Fantan replaced the MiG-derived nose intake with a solid nose section, carved out an internal bomb bay along the fuselage, and in doing so, became China's first truly indigenous combat aircraft design, rather than a copy of somebody else's blueprint. Top speed dropped slightly to around Mach 1.12, but payload capacity jumped to roughly 2,000 kilograms spread across 10 hardpoints. It wasn't built to win dogfights high above the clouds. It was built to fly low, hit targets on the ground, and come home in one piece. A year later, in 1966, the Chengdu J-7 arrived, another license-built copy, this time of the Soviet Mi-G-21 F-13. It would go on to become one of the most widely produced fighters in Chinese history. manufactured in dozens of distinct variants across more than 4 decades, and exported to well over a dozen countries. From Pakistan and Bangladesh to Iran and beyond, top speed reached a respectable Mach 2.05. But for most of its service life, it carried no meaningful radar to speak of, and that single fact defines the whole aircraft. It was a fast, cheap, disposable interceptor built for an era that was already quietly moving toward missiles fired from beyond visual range, a shift the J-7 was never designed to survive. Even so, later export models eventually gained a small radar and short-range missiles, keeping the design relevant far longer than its 1960s origins would suggest. Few people remember what came right after it. In December of 1970, Nanchang tried something different again, an entirely new lightweight, single-seat fighter called the J-12. Designed from the outset to be cheap enough to disperse across dozens of small, improvised airstrips in the event of a full-scale war. Only 9 airframes were ever built, 3 prototypes and 6 pre-production examples, and together they logged 135 test flights across roughly 61 hours in the air. Top speed was modest by comparison, around Mach 1.06, with a combat range of only about 430 miles and a service ceiling near 55,000 feet. It simply couldn't compete with the far more capable J-7, already rolling off production lines in far greater numbers, and in January of 1977, the entire program was quietly shelved. It never reached a single operational squadron. Chapter 2: Interceptors and Strikers. China builds its own designs. By 1969, China wanted something faster and higher flying than anything it had built before, and the answer was the Shenyang J-8. Its first genuinely original high-altitude interceptor rather than a foreign copy. Twin engines pushed it to Mach 2.2, with a service ceiling above 20,000 meters, built specifically to chase down high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft probing Chinese airspace. Later, J-82 models added a proper solid nose housing, an actual radar, along with semi-active radar-guided missiles, giving China its first real taste of genuine beyond visual range combat. But by the 1990s, facing Soviet-built Su-27 Su newly arriving in the region, the J-8 was already outclassed on paper. It stands as China's first true original fighter design, and also as a lesson in just how fast the technology curve was moving underneath it. Development itself had dragged on for over a decade, slowed by political upheaval at home and by the total loss of Soviet technical assistance, forcing Chinese engineers to solve problems almost entirely on their own for the first time. Nearly 2 decades later, a very different kind of aircraft rolled off the line, one built for the sea rather than the sky above it. The Xi'an JH-7, nicknamed the Flying Leopard, entered service in 1998 as a joint fighter bomber built specifically for maritime strike missions. It could carry roughly 9,000 kilograms of ordnance across 9 separate hardpoints, with a combat radius near 1,700 kilometers, more than enough to threaten shipping far off China's coastline. Later, JH-7A models added dedicated anti-ship missiles alongside modern air-to-air weapons for self-defense. It was never agile, and it was never meant to dogfight anyone. It was built to sink ships from a distance, and for that single job, it was more than enough. Crews nicknamed it the Flying Leopard for its speed on a strike run, but pilots who flew it in its early years often complained about a cramped, side-by-side cockpit that made long overwater missions genuinely exhausting. Chapter 3: The 4th Generation Workhorses. Multi-role power arrives. On the 23rd of March 1998, a Canard Delta fighter took off from Chengdu for the very first time, and it carried more history than its unusual shape suggested. Its design lineage traced directly back to a cancelled 1960s interceptor called the J-9, whose chief designer had been forced to watch it die on paper without a single prototype ever leaving the ground. That same engineer was reportedly standing at the runway in 1998, watching his Canard design finally take to the air, on what happened to be his own birthday, a date he had apparently chosen to mark years earlier. The aircraft was the J-10, and its refined J-10C variant, introduced around 2018, added a genuine AESA radar and became arguably China's most balanced modern fighter, roughly comparable in avionics terms to a late-model American F-16. Top speed reached Mach 1.8, combat radius around 1,240 kilometers, armed with domestic PL-15 long-range missiles and PL-10 short-range weapons. In 2022, Pakistan became its first export customer, marking the first time a Chinese fighter directly rivaled a Western jet in a live operational theater. For its first 2 decades in service, the J-10 flew on a Russian-built engine, a dependency that only ended once China's own domestic turbofan finally matched its performance. That same year, 1998, Shenyang rolled out an answer of its own, though this one didn't start from a blank sheet of paper. Under a licensing arrangement with Russia, China began assembling the Su-27SK domestically as the J-11, then gradually reverse-engineered its own version, the J-11B, swapping in domestic WS-10A turbofan engines by around 2007. It's a heavyweight, twin-engine air superiority fighter with a combat radius near 1,500 kilometers and a top speed of Mach 2.35. Solid, proven, dependable in the way license-built aircraft often are. But by the time the type finally matured, newer designs carrying AESA radar and genuine stealth shaping were already leaving it behind on the drawing board. China would go on to build several further branches of the same family, including a dedicated naval version and heavily upgraded variants carrying modern missiles. The original Su-27 was never designed to fire. Pakistan needed a fighter it could actually afford, and one it could eventually help build itself. And in 2003, that need produced the JF-17 Thunder, developed jointly with the Chengdu Aircraft Corporation, and powered, somewhat ironically, for a jointly designed aircraft, by a Russian-built Klimov engine. Combat radius sits around 1,350 kilometers, payload near 3,600 kilograms, spread across 7 hardpoints. The later Block 3 version added a genuine AESA radar and a helmet-mounted display, closing much of the technology gap almost overnight. By raw unit count, it remains China's single most successful fighter export, and today, it forms the backbone of Pakistan's entire air force. Beyond Pakistan, the type has since drawn interest from air forces across Africa and Southeast Asia, drawn less by raw performance than by a simple fact: it costs a fraction of a Western equivalent to buy and to keep flying. Not every entry on this list was ever meant to dominate the skies alone. The Hongdu L-15 Falcon, first flown in 2006, is a supersonic advanced trainer that grew into something rather more useful, a light attack variant called the L-15B, capable of hitting Mach 1.4 and carrying about 3,000 kilograms of ordnance into a fight. It's flown today by China's own August 1st aerobatic display team, and it has already been exported to Zambia. It will never headline a war on its own, but it quietly trains many of the pilots who go on to fly nearly everything else on this list, and without it, the pipeline behind every stealth fighter later in this story simply wouldn't function. Chapter 4: Carrier Power, Fighting from the Deck. China's first carrier fighter had an unusually complicated origin story, built around a prototype airframe that had originally been developed years earlier for the Soviet Union's own Su-33 program. First flown in 2009 and formally entering service in 2013, the Shenyang J-15, nicknamed Flying Shark, became the backbone of air wings operating from the decks of the Liaoning and the Shandong. Maximum takeoff weight sits near 33,000 kilograms, with a combat radius around 1,200 kilometers, and a payload capacity of about 6,500 kilograms across 12 hardpoints. Its biggest weakness was never really the airframe itself, it was the ski jump launch method used on both carriers, which forces pilots to sacrifice fuel and weapons weight just to get safely airborne. Early production aircraft also relied on imported Russian engines, a dependency Chinese engineers spent years trying to design their way out of. Around 2021, a variant appeared that had nothing to do with dogfighting at all. The J-15D swapped its wingtip missile rails for large jamming pods, becoming China's dedicated carrier-based electronic warfare aircraft, roughly analogous in role to America's own EA-18G Growler. Its two-seat cockpit gives one crew member the sole job of blinding enemy radar systems before a strike package ever gets within range. Then came the fix for the ski jump problem entirely. The J-15DT, also referred to as the J-15T, received a reinforced undercarriage built specifically for catapult launch rather than a ski jump ramp, and by 2024, it was flying with domestic WS-10 series engines instead of imported Russian AL-31 power plants. It became fully operational from the Fujian, China's first catapult-equipped aircraft carrier, formally commissioned in 2025. Catapult launch means heavier fuel loads, heavier weapons loads, and a genuinely longer combat reach-out over open water than anything the ski jump carriers could offer, closing a gap with American carrier aviation that had existed since the Liaoning first put to sea. Chapter 5. The Strike Fleet, Deep Reach, and Electronic War. Around 2015, Shenyang introduced what many analysts consider China's rough answer to America's F-15E Strike Eagle. The J-16 is a two-seat, twin-engine strike fighter carrying a genuine AESA radar, a combat radius near 1,500 kilometers, and an enormous payload capacity of about 12,000 kilograms across 12 separate hardpoints. It carries the full modern PLAAF arsenal, PL-15 missiles for long-range air combat, YJ-12 supersonic missiles for hitting ships at sea. It isn't a dogfighter first and foremost. It's a heavily armed truck that happens to fly faster than sound. Unlike the older J-11 it grew out of, the J-16 was designed from the outset around modern sensor fusion, letting the pilot and weapons officer share targeting data in real time rather than relying on separate, isolated systems. This one rarely gets the attention it probably deserves. Around 2020, a specialized variant called the J-16D appeared, distinguished by large jamming pods mounted on its wingtips and a notable absence, no internal cannon at all, that space traded away entirely for additional electronic warfare systems. Its job is to suppress and blind enemy air defense networks before manned strike aircraft ever arrive over the target, clearing an electronic path in much the same way the American Growler does for the United States Navy. It rarely appears in official photographs, and when it does, its wingtip pods are usually the only visible clue that something has changed underneath a familiar airframe. And then there's the one aircraft on this entire list with no cockpit at all. The Hongdu GJ-11, known as Sharp Sword, is a flying-wing stealth combat drone, first flown in 2013 and publicly revealed operating from a carrier deck around 2021. Estimated range sits around 4,000 kilometers, with an internal weapons bay built for precision-guided munitions. It's designed for the missions considered too dangerous to risk a human pilot on, suppressing enemy air defenses first, or flying as an unmanned wingman alongside crewed fighters like the J-20. It represents something none of the other aircraft on this list quite manage. A genuine glimpse of a future battlefield where not every aircraft in the formation needs someone sitting inside it. Its flying wing shape, with no vertical tail and smoothly blended engine intakes, was clearly built with radar evasion as the very first design requirement, not an afterthought bolted on at the end. Chapter 6. Into Stealth. China's fifth generation arrives. On the 11th of January 2011, the Chengdu J-20 made its maiden flight, and with it, China became only the fourth country on Earth to fly a genuine fifth-generation stealth fighter after the American F-22 and F-35 and the Russian Su-57. It formally entered service in March of 2017. The improved J-20A variant reshaped the nose cone and optimized the entire airframe for domestic WS-15 engines, cutting China's reliance on imported Russian power plants almost entirely. In testing, the J-20 has repeatedly been filmed carrying what analysts call beast mode loadouts, up to 14 missiles combining internal stealth bays and external hardpoints, including long-range PL-15 and reportedly PL-17 munitions. By September of 2025, the 300th production airframe had been confirmed, built, and photographed, making it the largest stealth fighter fleet flying anywhere outside the United States. Its combat radius is often cited as roughly double that of an American F-22 or F-35, a figure that shapes almost everything about how the PLAAF plans to use it: deep interdiction over long distances rather than short-range point defense. Then, in 2021, something happened that no other country had yet managed. Prototypes of a genuine twin-seat version began taxi testing near Chengdu, and by 2024 it was publicly unveiled at the Zhuhai Air Show as the J-20S. It became the world's first operational two-seat fifth-generation stealth fighter, giving one crew member the job of managing radar and weapons while a second manages something increasingly important on the modern battlefield: coordinating swarms of unmanned drones directly from the cockpit. It has since entered frontline service with the PLAAF's 172nd Air Brigade, no longer a prototype at all, but a genuine combat asset flying operational missions. Few people expected China to build an entirely second stealth fighter family from scratch, but that's exactly what happened next. Tracing its lineage back to the FC-31 demonstrator first shown publicly in 2012, the program eventually matured into the Shenyang J-35A, officially adopted by the PLAAF in late 2024. It measures about 17 meters long with an 11.5-meter wingspan, powered by twin WS-19 engines, producing a combined thrust that reportedly exceeds the single-engine output of an American F-35. Estimated combat radius sits around 600 miles, with internal weapons bays and a genuine AESA radar built specifically for stealth mode missions. In June of 2025, Pakistan reportedly became its first export customer, giving countries barred from buying the American F-35 a genuine stealth alternative on the open market for the very first time. The aircraft began life over a decade earlier as a privately funded demonstrator with no confirmed customer at all, and for years, Western analysts openly doubted it would ever become more than a Zhuhai Airshow display model. Chapter 7: The Next Generation. What comes after fifth generation? On the 26th of December 2024, civilians near Chengdu spotted something that looked like nothing else flying anywhere in the world at the time: a huge tailless aircraft shaped like a diamond, with no vertical tail whatsoever, and 3 engines buried deep into its blended airframe. For roughly 18 months, it existed only in grainy, unofficial photographs shared online, until the People's Liberation Army finally released the first official footage on the 28th of June 2026, unofficially named the J-36 after a serial number spotted painted on an early prototype. It's believed to reach speeds near Mach 2, operate at altitudes around 20 kilometers, and fly roughly 5,000 kilometers without needing to refuel. Its landing gear alone tells a story on its own: heavy, tandem, two-wheeled, clearly built to support an extremely large and extremely heavy airframe, likely well beyond the weight of any fighter China has fielded before it. A second and third prototype have since appeared, each showing visible changes to the shape of the wing and the intakes, suggesting the design is still evolving in real time rather than settling into a final production form. It's reportedly intended for air superiority, deep strike, interception, and controlling unmanned aircraft in combat, all from a single platform. American Air Force officials have quietly acknowledged that the J-36 could reach initial operational capability before their own next-generation fighter, the Boeing F-47, which currently isn't expected to fly until 2028 at the earliest. This one was different from the very start, because China wasn't satisfied building just one sixth-generation design. At almost exactly the same time Chengdu was flight testing the J-36, Shenyang was quietly developing a rival of its own, a smaller, twin-engine, tailless fighter believed to be aimed primarily at future carrier operations. It appeared publicly for the first time at the 3rd of September 2025 military parade in Beijing, seated among a formation of aircraft China had already officially confirmed as sixth-generation designs. Analysts have since designated it the J-50, and new imagery from early 2026 suggests active flight testing is already well underway. No other country in the world is currently running two competing sixth-generation fighter programs at the same time, at two entirely separate design bureaus, on deliberately compressed timelines. Whether either aircraft ultimately becomes a genuine, fielded combat weapon or remains an extraordinarily expensive technology demonstrator is still very much an open question. But the distance between a 1,956 subsonic copy of a Soviet fighter and a 2026 tailless trijet that quietly worries American planners says almost everything you need to know about how far and how fast this Air Force has traveled.